In the ruins of the 20th century lies a name that shaped history like no other: Adolf Hitler. A man who rose from obscurity to power, whose voice hypnotized nations, whose vision plunged the world into darkness. Was he a misunderstood patriot, a madman blinded by ideology, or a ruthless dictator driven by hate? In this documentary, we journey through the 7 chapters of Hitler's life, from his humble beginnings in Austria to his final days in a Berlin bunker. This is not just a story of a man, but of the world he changed forever. Welcome to Life of Hitler. He was born on April 20th, 1889, in a small town called Braunau am Inn, Austria, a child who no one could have imagined would one day plunge the world into chaos. Adolf Hitler entered the world as the son of Alois Hitler, a strict customs officer, and Clara, a gentle and caring mother. His childhood was marked by disciplined hardship and an environment where love and harshness collided. Alois was a man of authority, often cold and distant, while Clara was protective, shielding young Adolf from the harsh realities of life. This imbalance created in him a strange mixture of sensitivity and stubbornness, a child eager for recognition, yet overshadowed by the firm hand of his father. Hitler's early years were far from extraordinary. He was a mediocre student, restless, often daydreaming rather than focusing on his books. But he did have an obsession with art, architecture, and grand buildings. He imagined himself one day becoming a painter, sketching landscapes and monuments. Vienna was his dream, the city where culture thrived, where he could refine his talent and step into a future brighter than the small Austrian town of his birth. Yet destiny was unkind. Twice he applied for admission to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, and twice he was rejected. The doors of his artistic future closed, leaving him humiliated and wandering aimlessly. The death of his father when Adolf was just 13 left him with a void that was never truly filled. But a real tragedy struck when his beloved mother Clara died of cancer in 1907. Her loss broke him completely. Without her gentle presence, he was left alone in a world that seemed to constantly push him down. He lived in Vienna as a drifter, homeless at times, surviving on odd jobs, selling postcards with sketches, and often standing in long lines at shelters for poor. He became familiar with hunger, with rejection, with the bitterness of being unseen. It was here, in the streets of Vienna, that the darker seeds of his future began to take root. Vienna was a melting pot of cultures, religions, and political ideologies. It was in this city that Hitler encountered the wave of anti-Semitism that was spreading through Europe at the time. He absorbed these ideas, mixing them with his own growing frustrations and failures. Every rejection, every humiliation seemed to sharpen his hatred, making him believe that others would blame for his suffering. His dreams of art faded into a vision of revenge, power, and recognition. He felt he was destined for something greater, that the world had wronged him, and he would one day strike back. By the time Hitler left Vienna and later moved to Munich, he was no longer the boy who dreamed of painting cathedrals and landscapes. He was hardened, angry, and burning with resentment. His failure as an artist transformed into ambition for something far more dangerous. He read political pamphlets, attended rallies, and fed his mind with ideas of nationalism and racial superiority. The man who once imagined canvases filled with color now saw only the black and white vision of enemies and purity. He was shaping an identity built not on creation, but destruction. In his early life, there was nothing to suggest that Adolf Hitler would become the most infamous dictator in history. Yet the combination of a troubled childhood, personal failures, poverty, and exposure to hateful ideologies formed a storm within him. He was a man desperate to be recognized, to be remembered, and to avenge the pain of insignificance. And as the world around him moved closer to war, the stage was being quietly set for him to step forward. When the summer of 1914 arrived, the world stood on the brink of a conflict that would change the course of human history. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo ignited tensions that had been brewing for decades. Europe, already divided by alliances and rivalries, plunged into what would be known as the First World War. For Adolf Hitler, who at the time was living in Munich, this outbreak of war was not a tragedy. It was an opportunity. He was a young man adrift, with no clear direction, carrying the bitterness of rejection from Vienna and the scars of poverty. The war in his eyes was a chance for purpose, for belonging, for a stage upon which he could finally matter. When Germany declared war in August 1914, Hitler volunteered for the Bavarian army. Despite being Austrian by birth, his enthusiasm for the German cause was undeniable. He later wrote in his memoir Mein Kampf that he felt as if he had been born again when he was accepted as a soldier. For the first time, he wore a uniform, carried a rifle, and stood shoulder to shoulder with other men united by nationalism and duty. The war gave him what his failed years in Vienna never could: identity and belonging. Hitler was assigned as a messenger on the Western Front, a role that was both dangerous and vital. He carried messages between command posts, often under heavy fire. Unlike many soldiers who grew weary and disillusioned with the endless bloodshed, Hitler found in the chaos a strange sense of purpose. Letters from his comrades described him as dedicated, fearless, and somewhat detached from normal soldierly life. He rarely sought friendships or indulgences, living instead for the cause of Germany's victory. But the reality of the war was horrifying. Hitler lived through the trenches of France and Belgium, where mud, rats, and disease were constant companions. He saw men torn apart by artillery, entire units decimated by machine gun fire, and the devastation brought by poison gas. He himself was injured twice, once by shrapnel, and another time temporarily blinded by a mustard gas attack in 1918. These injuries earned him the Iron Cross, second class, and later the Iron Cross, first class, which was an unusual honor for someone of his rank. These decorations, along with his survival against overwhelming odds, reinforced in his mind that destiny had chosen him for something greater. Historically, World War I was a conflict of unprecedented scale. Empires collapsed, millions perished, and entire landscapes were turned into wastelands. For Germany, the war began with dreams of quick victory, but soon became a nightmare of attrition. The Battle of the Somme, Verdun, and Ypres became names etched in blood. Soldiers lived in a constant cycle of attack, retreat, and survival, with little hope of triumph. For Hitler, however, the war cemented his worldview. He saw Germany as a nation betrayed by weak leadership and undermined by internal enemies. The humiliation of Germany's eventual defeat in 1918 struck him deeply, more than any wound he had suffered on the battlefield. When the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, Hitler was lying in a hospital, recovering from his gas-induced blindness. He described the moment as the greatest shock of his life. To him, Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, but rather stabbed in the back by traitors, politicians, and Jews, a narrative he would later weaponize to justify his rise to power. The Treaty of Versailles that followed only deepened his resentment. The treaty imposed crushing reparations on Germany, stripped it of territories, and placed the blame for the war squarely on its shoulders. For millions of Germans, it was a national humiliation. For Hitler, it was personal. He believed it was his mission to reverse this injustice, to restore Germany's pride, and to punish those he blamed for its collapse. Thus, the war did more than give Hitler a uniform and medals. It gave him a cause. The trenches had molded him. The defeat had embittered him, and the humiliation of Versailles had ignited a fire that would later consume Europe. Without World War I, Adolf Hitler might have remained a failed artist wandering the streets. With it, he found his voice, his fury, and his justification. The soldier of the First World War was quietly transforming into the political figure who would one day ignite the Second. In the aftermath of Germany's defeat in World War I, the nation was in chaos. The empire had collapsed, the Kaiser had abdicated, and the fragile Weimar Republic was born. It was a democracy built on shaky ground, plagued by political unrest, poverty, and humiliation from the Treaty of Versailles. Inflation skyrocketed, unemployment spread, and ordinary Germans felt betrayed by their leaders. In the midst of this despair, a space was created for voices of anger and revenge. It was here that Adolf Hitler began his journey into politics, stepping out of the shadows of a failed soldier into the arena of power. In 1919, Hitler joined a small nationalist group known as the German Workers' Party, led by Anton Drexler. It was a minor organization with little influence, but Hitler immediately recognized its potential. His talent for fiery oratory quickly set him apart. He could transform a room of disillusioned men into a chorus of rage and unity. His speeches were filled with passion, blaming Germany's suffering on Jews, communists, and the November criminals who had signed the armistice. By 1920, the party was renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, and Hitler was at its center. The early 1920s in Germany were marked by instability. Political uprisings shook the streets. Communists clashed with nationalists, and the economy collapsed under the weight of hyperinflation. At one point, the value of the German mark plummeted so low that people carried wheelbarrows full of money to buy a loaf of bread. In such desperate times, Hitler's words seemed like salvation to many. He promised to restore German pride, rebuild the economy, and punish those he claimed were responsible for their humiliation. His message was simple, yet dangerously effective. Unity through exclusion, strength through hatred, and greatness through war. In 1923, emboldened by growing support, Hitler and the Nazis attempted to seize power in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch in Munich. Inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome in Italy, Hitler believed he could replicate the same success. Surrounded by armed supporters, he declared a revolution and marched through the streets. But the uprising failed. Police opened fire, killing 16 Nazis, and Hitler was arrested. Many expected his political career to be over, yet prison became a stage. During his trial, he transformed himself from a failed revolutionary into a national figure. His speeches in court were widely reported, and instead of appearing as a criminal, he painted himself as a patriot willing to sacrifice for Germany. Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison, but served only 9 months. During his time behind bars, he dictated Mein Kampf, My Struggle, a book that laid out his twisted vision for Germany's future. It was a mix of autobiography, ideology, and political blueprint. He wrote about his hatred for Jews, his belief in Aryan racial superiority, and his dream of expanding Germany's territory to create Lebensraum, or living space. Few at the time took the book seriously, but it would later become the manifesto of a movement that plunged the world into war. When Hitler was released in 1924, he found Germany still in turmoil, but also recovering slightly. The Nazis had lost momentum, and many thought his time had passed. But Hitler was patient. He reorganized the party, built a loyal paramilitary force called the SA, the Brown Shirts, and focused on winning power not through uprisings but through politics. By the late 1920s, the Great Depression struck, devastating economies worldwide. For Germany, already weakened by reparations, it was catastrophic. Millions lost their jobs, businesses collapsed, and once again, desperation filled the streets. This was the moment Hitler had been waiting for. The Nazis offered not just anger but order, not just hatred but hope, twisted though it was. Propaganda became their weapon, with posters, rallies, and symbols like the swastika capturing the imagination of the masses. Hitler's speeches drew thousands, his voice rising from calm reason to fiery rage, mesmerizing crowds and making them believe he alone could save Germany. By 1930, the Nazis were no longer a fringe group. They had become one of the largest political parties in the Reichstag, the German parliament. Hitler, once a failed artist and forgotten soldier, was now a rising star of German politics. His path was clear. He would not rest until he held absolute power. And as the world looked away, distracted by its own crises, Hitler prepared to transform his vision into reality. By the early 1930s, Germany was on the verge of collapse. The Great Depression had destroyed its economy. Unemployment soared to nearly 6 million, and the fragile Weimar Republic was paralyzed by political deadlock. Ordinary citizens had lost faith in democracy, desperate for a strong leader who could restore order and pride. Adolf Hitler, through the Nazi Party, presented himself as that leader. His speeches thundered across Germany, filled with promises of jobs, unity, and national rebirth, while secretly carrying the seeds of dictatorship and destruction. In 1932, Hitler ran for president against the aging war hero Paul von Hindenburg. Though he lost, securing about 36% of the vote, it was a sign of how far he had risen. His party became the largest in the Reichstag, but power was not yet fully in his hands. Behind the scenes, conservative politicians, industrialists, and military leaders believed they could use Hitler to stabilize the country. They thought they could control him, a mistake that would soon prove fatal. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Crowds cheered in the streets, believing a savior had arrived. Few realized they had just welcomed the beginning of a dictatorship. Once in office, Hitler wasted no time dismantling democracy. Just weeks later, in February 1933, the Reichstag building was set ablaze. The Nazis quickly blamed the fire on communists, calling it proof of a conspiracy against Germany. Using fear as a weapon, Hitler pushed through the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended civil liberties, silenced free press, and allowed political opponents to be arrested without trial. The stage was set for total control. In March, the Enabling Act was passed, giving Hitler the power to pass laws without the Reichstag's approval. With one stroke, democracy ended and dictatorship began. Opposition was crushed swiftly. Trade unions were abolished, rival political parties were banned, and thousands of opponents were thrown into prisons and early concentration camps. The SA, the Nazi paramilitary force, intimidated and terrorized anyone who dared resist. But even among his own ranks, Hitler feared rivals. In June 1934, during the infamous Night of the Long Knives, he ordered the execution of Ernst Röhm, leader of the SA, along with hundreds of others he considered threats. This ruthless purge not only secured the loyalty of the German army, but also sent a chilling message. No one was safe from Hitler's reach. When President Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler merged the positions of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer, the supreme leader of Germany. The military was forced to swear an oath of loyalty not to the nation, but to Hitler personally. From that moment, his word was law. The transformation was complete. From a failed artist and a struggling soldier, Adolf Hitler now stood as the absolute ruler of one of the most powerful nations in Europe. As Führer, Hitler reshaped Germany into a totalitarian state. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels flooded the airwaves, newspapers, and film with Nazi ideology. Every aspect of life, education, art, religion, even leisure, was brought under state control. Children joined the Hitler Youth, trained to worship their leader and prepare for war. Dissent was impossible, as the Gestapo, the secret police, kept the population in fear. Jews, communists, intellectuals, and anyone considered an enemy were persecuted, stripped of rights, and marked for exclusion from society. Economically, Hitler's policies appeared successful at first. Massive public works programs, such as the construction of the Autobahn, reduced unemployment. Rearmament projects fueled industries and gave jobs to millions. To many Germans, Hitler seemed to have delivered on his promises. Crowds filled stadiums, cheering him as a visionary who had restored pride to the nation. Yet beneath the surface, this prosperity was built on aggression, militarization, and the exploitation of minorities. It was not a foundation for peace, but for war. Internationally, Hitler tested the patience of Europe by defying the Treaty of Versailles. He rebuilt Germany's military, withdrew from the League of Nations, and began preparing for expansion. The world watched cautiously, some dismissing him as just another authoritarian leader, others hoping his ambitions would be limited. But Hitler had no intention of stopping. He believed history had chosen him to lead Germany to greatness, and he would stop at nothing to achieve it. By the mid-1930s, Adolf Hitler was not just a Führer of Germany. He was the architect of a new order, one built on absolute control, fear, and hatred. What began as political maneuvering had turned into complete domination. And as Germany marched in lockstep under his command, the rest of the world stood on the edge of a storm that would soon engulf them all. By the late 1930s, Hitler's vision of a new German empire was no longer a secret. He openly defied the Treaty of Versailles, expanding the military, building tanks, planes, and warships, while the rest of Europe hesitated, trapped between fear and hope of avoiding another devastating conflict. To the German people, he was a hero who had restored pride and strength. To the world, he was becoming a menace that could no longer be ignored. The first steps of his expansion seemed bloodless, almost clever. In 1936, he ordered German troops into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone forbidden by the Versailles Treaty. The French and British, unwilling to risk war, did nothing. Encouraged, Hitler moved further. In March 1938, he annexed Austria in what was called the Anschluss. German troops rolled into Vienna, welcomed by cheering crowds. Hitler, the failed artist once rejected by Vienna's art schools, now returned as its conqueror. Europe watched but remained silent. Later that year, Hitler turned his eyes toward Czechoslovakia. Claiming to protect ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland, he demanded its territory. The British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain met with him in Munich and, desperate to preserve peace, agreed to Hitler's demands. Chamberlain returned to London, declaring peace for our time. But Hitler had no intention of stopping. In March 1939, he invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, proving his word was worthless. Still, the world hesitated. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler unleashed a storm. German forces invaded Poland with a new style of warfare, blitzkrieg or lightning war. Tanks, planes, and troops moved with shocking speed, overwhelming Polish defenses. Just 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. For Hitler, it was a moment he had long awaited, the chance to remake Europe under Nazi domination. In the early years, Hitler's armies seemed unstoppable. In April 1940, they invaded Denmark and Norway, securing vital resources. In May, German forces swept into Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The world watched in disbelief as France, one of Europe's strongest powers, collapsed in just 6 weeks. Hitler stood in Paris, gazing at the Eiffel Tower, the symbol of victory over an old enemy. Across Europe, Nazi banners replaced national flags, and Hitler's empire expanded with terrifying speed. But perhaps his most dangerous gamble came in 1941. Believing himself invincible, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Millions of German soldiers poured across the eastern frontier in the largest military operation in history. At first, it seemed successful. Vast territories were captured, and Soviet forces were pushed back. But the Russian land was merciless. The vast distances, harsh winters, and relentless Soviet resistance turned the campaign into a nightmare. In the ruins of cities like Stalingrad, German soldiers faced starvation, frostbite, and death. The war that Hitler believed would last just months dragged on, draining Germany of men and resources. Meanwhile, Hitler's policies grew ever more brutal. Under his command, the Nazis waged not only a war for territory, but also a war of extermination. The invasion of Poland and the Soviet Union brought millions of Jews under Nazi control. In secret camps, ghettos, and mass shootings, the Holocaust began, claiming millions of lives. For Hitler, this was not merely about conquest, but about reshaping humanity itself through violence and genocide. Yet in the early years, many Germans saw only victory. Propaganda painted Hitler as a genius, the Führer who had humbled Europe. But the seeds of destruction were already sown. His relentless ambition stretched Germany's strength too far. By declaring war on the United States after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, he ensured that the world's largest industrial power would join the fight against him. Germany, once ascended, was now surrounded by powerful enemies. For a brief moment, Hitler stood at the height of his power, ruling over a vast empire from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow. But beneath the triumphs, the cracks were widening. His vision of a 1,000-year Reich was built on conquest, hatred, and fear. Like all such empires, it was destined to fall. The war that it ignited in the hope of eternal glory would soon turn against him, dragging him and Germany into the abyss. By 1942, Adolf Hitler stood at the peak of his power. His armies stretched from the Atlantic coast of France to the heart of Russia, and much of Europe lay beneath the shadow of the swastika. Yet even at this height, cracks were appearing. Hitler's ambitions had pushed Germany beyond its limits, and the tide of war was about to turn. What began as unstoppable triumph soon descended into slow, grinding defeat. The turning point came on the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, had promised a swift victory over the Soviet Union. At first, German forces advanced deep into Russian territory, capturing cities and surrounding Soviet armies. But by winter, the campaign faltered. The bitter cold froze tanks, weapons, and soldiers alike. In 1942, Hitler focused on seizing Stalingrad, a city on the Volga River. It became the bloodiest battle in history. German troops fought street by street, house by house, in a brutal contest of endurance. Hitler refused to allow retreat, declaring that the Sixth Army must hold the city at all costs. But in February 1943, the unthinkable happened. The German army surrendered. Nearly 300,000 men were lost. Stalingrad was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological blow that shattered the illusion of German invincibility. Meanwhile, in North Africa, Hitler's forces under General Rommel had battled the British across deserts and dunes. At first, Rommel's daring maneuvers won victories, earning him the nickname Desert Fox. But by late 1942, the tide shifted. At El Alamein, British forces halted the advance, and soon Allied troops, reinforced by American power, drove the Germans out of Africa entirely. For the first time, the Nazis were being pushed back on multiple fronts. Hitler's own leadership contributed to the downfall. Obsessed with absolute control, he refused to listen to his generals, insisting on decisions based on ideology rather than military logic. His belief in destiny blinded him to reality. As Germany's enemies grew stronger, he demanded total war, stripping resources from civilians and pushing the nation deeper into ruin. Yet propaganda continued to promise victory, even as bombs rained down on German cities. Night after night, Allied planes unleashed destruction, reducing Hamburg, Berlin, and Dresden to smoking ruins. In 1944, the Allies prepared their greatest gamble, the invasion of Western Europe. On June 6, D-Day, thousands of ships crossed the English Channel, landing American, British, and Canadian troops on the beaches of Normandy. It was the largest seaborne invasion in history. Despite fierce resistance, the Allies broke through. France, once conquered in weeks, was liberated in months. By the autumn of 1944, Allied armies were pressing toward Germany from the west, while the Soviets advanced relentlessly from the east. Hitler's dream of empire was collapsing. Inside Germany, whispers of resistance grew louder. Even within his own military, some officers believed Hitler was leading the nation to destruction. On July 20th, 1944, a group of German officers attempted to assassinate him by planting a bomb at his headquarters. The explosion killed 4 people, but Hitler survived with minor injuries. Furious, he launched a wave of purges, executing thousands, convinced that betrayal lurked everywhere. Instead of facing reality, he sank deeper into paranoia, isolating himself from advisors, and clinging to delusions of victory. By late 1944, Germany was being squeezed from all sides. The Battle of the Bulge in December was Hitler's last desperate attempt to turn the tide. German forces launched a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, briefly pushing the Allies back. But the effort failed, exhausting what little strength remained. When the snows melted, Allied tanks rolled into Germany itself. Cities were reduced to rubble, the economy collapsed, and civilians faced hunger and despair. Still, Hitler refused to surrender. He demanded total loyalty, insisting that Germany fight to the last man, even as the nation crumbled around him. The downfall of Hitler's empire was no longer a question of if, but when. What had begun with lightning victories and dreams of a 1,000-year Reich was ending in flames and ruin. The Führer who once commanded millions now found himself trapped, surrounded, and doomed. As the Allies closed in from all directions, Hitler prepared for the final act of his life, not with glory, but with destruction. By early 1945, the Reich that Adolf Hitler promised would last 1,000 years was collapsing in less than 12. Allied forces were closing in from the west, while the Red Army stormed in from the east, burning a path through what remained of Nazi defenses. German cities lay in ruins, millions were dead, and the once proud Wehrmacht was broken and retreating. Yet, in the heart of Berlin, deep beneath the shattered capital, Hitler refused to face reality. From his underground bunker, he clung to fantasies of victory, issuing orders to divisions that no longer existed and demanding sacrifices from a nation already bled dry. The bunker itself was a dim and claustrophobic maze of concrete walls, lit with harsh lamps and filled with the constant echo of typewriters, phones, and desperate voices. Here, Hitler isolated himself with his closest aides, including Eva Braun, the woman who had long been a companion in private but rarely acknowledged in public. As bombs thundered overhead, shaking the ground, Hitler appeared frail and aged, his body trembling from illness and stress. Gone was a fiery orator who once commanded vast crowds. In his place was a broken man, consumed by paranoia and rage. Outside the bunker, the situation was hopeless. Soviet forces encircled Berlin, their artillery reducing the city to rubble. The last offenders, including teenage boys from the Hitler Youth and old men pressed into service, fought bravely but pointlessly against overwhelming odds. Civilians starved in basements, trapped between the crumbling city and the advancing army. For many Germans, the end was not just military defeat, but total devastation. The dream of empire had turned into a nightmare of fire and ash. In April 1945, Hitler celebrated his 56th birthday in the bunker. It was a grim occasion, attended by only a handful of loyal followers. Outside, Berlin was burning. Even as defeat stared him in the face, he refused to surrender, insisting that Germany fight to the last breath. But in private, he admitted what he could never say aloud. The war was lost, and so was he. On April 29, 1945, Hitler finally married Eva Braun in a brief ceremony inside the bunker. It was an act of defiance, a final attempt at normalcy amid chaos. The very next day, April 30th, as Soviet troops closed within blocks of the Reich Chancellery, Hitler and Eva retreated to a small room. Hitler dictated his last will and testament, blaming the Jews for war, condemning his generals, and declaring loyalty to his twisted ideology even in death. Then, in a moment that ended one of history's darkest chapters, Adolf Hitler took his own life, while Eva Braun followed him in suicide. Their bodies were carried outside, doused in gasoline and burned, leaving behind only ashes. News of Hitler's death spread quickly, but the war was not yet over. In the days that followed, German resistance collapsed. On May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered to the Allies. The Second World War in Europe was finished, but its scars remained for generations. Tens of millions were dead, cities destroyed, families shattered, and entire nations forever changed. The Holocaust had claimed the lives of 6 million Jews and millions of others, Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, victims of an ideology born in hatred. Hitler's legacy was not one of greatness, but of destruction. His rise had been fueled by anger, fear, and desperation, but his rule left only ruin. He showed the world how dangerous unchecked power and blind devotion could be. For Germany, the aftermath meant division between East and West, rebuilding from ashes, and confronting the horrors committed in its name. For the world, it was a lesson etched in blood, that hatred, when armed with power, could consume entire nations. Yet even in death, Hitler's shadow lingered. History remembers him not for the empire he dreamed of, but for the devastation he unleashed. His name became synonymous with evil, a warning for all time of how far humanity can fall when hate replaces humanity and ambition drowns out morality. From the bunker in Berlin, his life ended, but the lessons of his tyranny remain alive, teaching every generation to remain vigilant against those who promise glory through destruction. The life of Adolf Hitler is a warning carved into the memory of humanity. His rise reminds us how desperation can turn into dictatorship. His fall proves that no empire built on hate can last. The scars of his actions still shape our world, urging us never to forget the cost of silence and blind obedience. If this journey through history moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to History Vault, and share with others who seek to learn from the past. Together, let's keep history alive, so its darkest chapters are never repeated.